We face enormous challenges as a species. 15,000 kids die from easily preventable diseases every day. We've got the next pandemic around the corner. We've got the threat of nuclear war, climate change. The list goes on and on and on. And we need our smartest, our most ambitious, our most privileged people to be working on those challenges. There's something liberating about the idea that you don't need to find the answers inside yourself,
right,
but that you can just ask the world the question, okay, here I am. What can I do? Like, where am I needed? How can I contribute the most?
From the news team at LinkedIn, I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. It's our show about work on our own terms. I have a new term for you today. It's called moral ambition, and I have a feeling you're going to want to adopt it immediately to describe yourself. It's what transpires when we put our skills and our drive to work in service of our conscience, to do work that matters. And maybe you're feeling like that's you. You get to work every day on things that matter to you. Well, you're lucky. More likely, you are like most people, beaten down by the system, occasionally tired to the point of feeling burnt out. Because here's the thing, our current work culture, our system doesn't reward this way of thinking. It doesn't reward moral ambition. We're taught to pursue personal success, right? To optimize for our title, our paycheck, to climb and climb and climb. That's why the two most popular careers for students coming out of Harvard these days are finance, banking, and consulting. Now look, there is nothing wrong with those paths. Maybe that's your heart's desire. But our guest today introduces a different way of thinking about the choices you're making. This idea of moral ambition is the answer to the larger question of why. Why am I showing up every day? What am I creating? What am I adding to? What does it total? Today's guest is Rutger Bregman. He's a Dutch historian and a best-selling author. His current two books, their titles are Utopia for Realists and Humankind, A Hopeful History. Honestly, it's hard not to want to see the world the way that Rutger sees this world. His newest book is called Moral Ambition, How to Stop Wasting Your Talent and Start Making a Difference. Now, if you're feeling even the least bit indecisive about your current career path, this episode is for you. Because today, Rutger and I are going to get into the specifics of identifying this kind of ambition and holding on to it. And spoiler alert, it's not about following your passion. It's not about knowing what is going to make a difference. It's about looking up and out and seeing what the world is asking specifically and uniquely of you. Rutger will help us see how each of us, regardless of our job title, has something unique to contribute. You matter. Here's Rutger. What is moral ambition?
So I would say it's pretty simple. It's a combination of two things. It's the idealism of an activist and the ambition of an entrepreneur. When those two things come together, I think something really magical happens.
So I'm just going to say that is how I felt that every day of my work life should and would be when I was 23. But here in the middle of my career, I find that I sometimes get lost for a while, right? And in fact, in moments of great burnout, reach a place where I'm questioning whether what I do matters at all, why I'm doing it. It's like I feel energetically stuck. And so I was very curious whether this idea you have about moral ambition could function as sort of a guide for those of us who are similarly remembering that a career can be a huge opportunity, but maybe feeling a little bit distant from it.
Yeah. So that's exactly the place where I started, when I started working on this book. My whole career, and I've spent around 500 weeks now. I mean, a total career is 2,000 work weeks on average. So I'm at a quarter. But my whole career, I've been fascinated and disturbed by what I call the waste of talent. In the book, I cite one study in particular, a huge study done by two Dutch economists who found that around 25% of people in modern economies doubt the social value of their own work. So around 8% of people are really sure that their own work doesn't contribute anything to society, and around 17% are unsure. So that adds up to around a quarter of people, which is insane, if you ask me. I mean, that's 5 times the unemployment rate of people who often have a quite nice resume, who went to fancy universities, who sometimes make quite a lot of money as well. But at the end of the day, if you really ask them, like, okay, but if you would go on strike, would that be a problem? They don't have an immediate answer. They're like, well, maybe not. And that is, to me, one of the greatest wastes of our time.
That feeling like it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I'm in it for the money, or I'm in it for the job, or I don't even know why I'm in it. It's just the thing I do.
Yeah.
Is that sort of a symptom of a contemporary age? Would that have been true for my grandparents?
That's a really good question. So I'm trained as a historian. And if you go back a long, long time, so let's say 200 years, you would be in a world where 95% of people work in agriculture. So those were pretty essential jobs. Obviously, if people would stop working, they'd be very hungry very soon.
Right.
And then people moved from, the farms to the factories, and from the factories to the offices. And that has brought us immense prosperity, obviously. But immense prosperity also, brings us the opportunity to, waste more of our time in jobs that don't necessarily need to exist.
Right.
I've actually wrote my first book about this, Utopia for Realists, more than a decade ago. When I wrote about this prediction that the great economist John Maynard Keynes once made. He said that in the year 2030, so that's just 5 years from now.
Kind of coming up.
Yeah, we would have a 15-hour work week, 1 to 5.
Right.
Just because, the economy would keep growing and we will be able to trade a lot of that increased productivity for more leisure.
Right.
Well, things didn't really go in that direction.
I have to say, I think, and we talk about this a lot on the show, I think we have to really think about this word productivity, because it has translated, in my experience, in a modern day work culture, into busyness. And the more opportunity we have to let the machines work on our behalf, ostensibly to free up our time, the more ways we find to be busy and use more of that time without asking necessarily to what end.
Exactly. And that's the fundamental question, to what end, right? It's really interesting if you dig into the data, like who are these people who doubt the social value of their jobs? Well, they're not the essential workers, not the teachers, the nurses, the garbage collectors. They understand very well that if they go on strike, that would be a little bit of a problem.
We're all screwed.
Yeah. And some people would say, oh, it must be mostly people in the public sector, right? Because, all these civil servants, they're not really working. That's sometimes the stereotype we have. Well, actually, to the contrary. So in this study, we see that people are 4 times as likely to consider their own job socially useless if they're in the private sector.
Help us understand how we get here and what it means.
So what I'm fundamentally trying to do in my book, Moral Ambition, is to redefine what it means to be successful. So take a prestigious university like Harvard, right? 45% of Harvard graduates end up in what a friend of mine calls the Bermuda Triangle of talent. So you've got consultancy, you've got finance, you've got corporate law, and that's sucking up almost half of all these, really talented people. And look, I'm some of my best friends are consultants. So
what you're talking about is an immediate move to profit, right? Like all 3 of those professions are very well-paying professions. Yeah,
many students would call it selling out, indeed. That's, I think, the technical term that they use.
Sure.
I don't want to say that, all of corporate law or all of consultancy or all finance. Obviously, these are useful sectors. But I'm really questioning whether this is the best allocation of talent. Like half? Really? So many? That doesn't make sense to me. We face enormous challenges as a species. 15,000 kids die from easily preventable diseases every day. We've got the next pandemic around the corner. We've got the threat of nuclear war, climate change. The list goes on and on and on. And we need our smartest, our most ambitious, our most privileged people to be working on those challenges.
And why do you think that people aren't motivated to do so? And I'm throwing you a bone here. I'm asking you to tell me that it's not all about money, that folks opted into these professions for other reasons. Could be totally wrong about that.
Yeah. I'm not the one who's going to say, oh, money doesn't matter. Obviously, it matters, right? It matters to me, probably matters to you as well. So it is one of the incentives that is at play here. And indeed, if you go and work for, a corporate law firm, just out of Harvard, what do you make? Someone was telling me recently, maybe $200K or something like that. That's much more than if you would go to a nonprofit. So money does play a role. I would say, though, that the most important thing that is at play here is prestige and how we define prestige.
Okay.
So there are simply a lot of people out there who just want to be among the best,
Right.
who are, they want to climb the ladder.
Yeah.
They want to be successful. And it's really interesting to see and disturbing to see that our definition of success has shifted in America in the last 50 years. So there's a famous poll that is being done since the late 60s in the US, where freshmen were being asked, what is the most important thing to you in life? What are some of your most important life goals? In 1970, about 80 to 90% of students said, developing a meaningful philosophy of life is my number one life goal. And only 50% said that making a lot of money was their most important life goal. It's now 80 to 90% of students who think that being very well off financially is their most important life goal, while only 50% says developing a meaningful philosophy of life is their most important life goal. So that is depressing. On the other hand, it shows us that this is not human nature, that it can change. And as a historian, I've looked into other periods in history where we were successful at changing our definition of success.
Yeah.
The most important example in the US, I would say, is the move from the Gilded Era, an age of profound inequality and selfishness and immorality. And then after that came the Progressive Era. So it's possible. We've done it before.
It's funny now in hindsight to look back at those periods and realize how quickly, in retrospect, those changes happened. A decade, 2 decades, an entire mindset can shift. And that gives me some hope for the future. Because you're right, this moment that we're in is a moment where I think, driven by fear about the future and a scarcity mindset.
That's absolutely true.
Okay, so how do we change that?
Well, we try and build a movement around redefining what it means to be successful. That's what we're doing. Yeah. So I've not just written a book about what this could mean. I've also co-founded an organization called the School for Moral Ambition. And we try to be a beacon for the most talented, most driven people who want to work on the most pressing issues of our time. It is deliberately quite exclusive. And that is actually sort of the point, because we sometimes working on the most important problems at an NGO, for example, is seen as, boring or not like what the quote unquote successful people do.
Sure.
But it should be the other way around. People who fight child mortality, they're the heroes,
Sure.
Something like USAID, we should see that as the coolest thing ever, the coolest department of government fighting the biggest, most entrenched problems out there.
So this idea of moral ambition presupposes that one can identify a problem to work on and feels motivated around the idea that they uniquely can have an impact. And both of those ideas are kind of hard to come by in this culture, I think.
Yes.
So how do we seed them? Because let me tell you, this is what I want for my 6-year-old. Right? This is the environment in which I want him to come of age.
Well, it's actually interesting. If you go to Google Ngram, this amazing tool that helps you to search for keywords in books that were published in the last decades. And then you type in follow your passion. Then you see the extraordinary rise of this phrase. So 30 or 40 years ago, people hardly used it. And now it's everywhere. It's become the cliche, the standard advice of job coaches. It's like, okay, what do you want out of life? You have your midlife crisis. Well, find your passion.
We hate that phrase on the show as a standalone.
Okay.
FYI.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to hear, because I think it's terrible career advice.
Yeah.
Especially if you want to do a lot of good. We at the School for Moral Ambition, we follow the so-called Gandalf-Frodo model. Gandalf never asked Frodo, "Oh, Frodo, what's your passion?" Right? He was like, "Dude, this needs to happen. Throw the ring into the mountain." So that's also how we work. We start with so-called prioritization research. You make a long list of the most pressing, neglected global issues. Then you stack rank them. And then you arrive at some problems who are like the most pressing. And then you're like Gandalf, who's like, okay, this needs to happen. Who's with me?
Yeah. This comes back to this idea of a movement. Can we do this alone?
No, absolutely not. So you need other people in your life. We started something called the Moral Ambition Circle. It was actually a little bit inspired by what Sheryl Sandberg did with Lean In a long time ago.
With her Lean In circles.
Yeah. Which was a powerful example of how you can use a book to start a bit of a movement, right? So now in Europe, we have about 1,500 people participating in one of our moral ambition circles. We've developed a curriculum. And yeah, people come together around these questions.
Right.
What are some of the most pressing global issues? What can I do? You know, what's the first step? What are my super skills, etc. And it's much easier to do it with others. I've always loved this quote from Margaret Mead, who said that we should never doubt the power of small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. So find yourself a small group like that, and then you can begin.
Okay, but in this moment, let's go back to that Margaret Mead. I don't think it always holds. I think sometimes we have too many groups of small people all working in isolation without ever identifying the singular context for that work and being able to roll up into something that actually approximates a movement. How do we make that bridge, that transition to actually have real impact around?
Yeah. Coalition building is absolutely essential. In the book, I write a lot about the British abolitionists. They were the most successful abolitionist movement, and coalition building was absolutely essential to it. So initially, it was just a bunch of Quakers, this small radical Protestant sect. But once they started working together with the evangelicals, that's when the movement really got started. And actually, quite a few of these people, strongly disagreed on many things. Some of them really disliked one another.
Yes.
But that's what it takes. That's what it means to be morally serious and morally ambitious. And too often today, we have idealists or progressives who are so in love with their own ideas that they find it too hard to work together with others.
Yes.
To their detriment. Because then what you become is something, what I call the noble loser, right? You can say, oh, I was on the right side of history, but actually I lost the elections again. I didn't get anything done, right? And this is what we can learn from the entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs are always, or the good entrepreneurs at least, they're focused on actually achieving shit, getting things done.
Right.
So yeah, that's what we need.
The thing that it makes me think is that you don't actually need to be on the right side of history to be able to launch an idea.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right? And I think maybe we're all experiencing what that feels like right now. You said something toward the beginning of our conversation that I want to go back to and unpack a little bit.
Sure.
Because it factors into how we make the choices we make about how we're going to spend our time. Something to the effect of whether people are inherently morally just or driven to do good. You suggested that no, people don't have an inherent bias one way or the other. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, actually, my previous book, Humankind, is a long, long argument about why we've evolved to be friendly, to work together, and that we're the product of survival of the friendliest. I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to write More Ambition is that at some point, I started to see these images popping up on Instagram of readers reading Humankind, the previous book, saying, oh, this is such a lovely book. It has restored my faith in humanity, and everything is wonderful here. And this is a lovely beach, and we're going to Bali. And I was like, oh, have I created a monster? Is this making people too complacent? So if that book was a warm hug, then this one is a warm shower. Like, yes, most people are pretty decent, right?
Yeah.
But maybe sometimes we need much more than just being pretty decent, right? Especially if you're a bit more privileged, right? This book is not a sermon aimed at, the teachers and the nurses and the care workers, right? They don't need me. This is a sermon, aimed at, well, frankly, people like me.
Yeah.
I was fed up with myself. I was like, okay, Rutger, you've got a pretty big platform. You've got some power you can wield. What are you actually doing with it, right?
Right.
This seems to be a pretty pivotal time in history. And then I was looking around at some of my friends who indeed went to great universities, and one of them was a corporate lawyer, one of them was a consultant. I'm like, what the hell are you guys doing, right? The world is burning out there. Shouldn't we do something?
I think that conversation reflects so many of the dinner conversations that I have, honestly, with friends around the table these days. Many of us who started out with pure conviction around the paths that we chose are now saddled with mortgages and children who need college and far more cynical than we were. And perhaps we've taken our careers in whatever direction we think we can continue to pay those mortgages with.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be honest. I never called myself an activist. An activist feels like a politically loaded word to me.
Yeah.
I want the world to be better, but activism.
Sure. Well, you don't have to be an activist. There are many, many roles to play in every movement. We need lobbyists, we need activists, we need entrepreneurs, we need so many.
But
It's not just
what
like
you're asking for is for me to reactivate purpose.
Sure.
Right? And self-driven purpose, not a purpose that was given to me, perhaps a purpose that I feel inspired to join, but I've got to reach internally and find that.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say you necessarily need to reach internally. I think there's something liberating about the idea that you don't need to find the answers inside yourself,
Right.
but that you can just ask the world the question, okay, here I am, what can I do? Like, where am I needed? How can I contribute the most? So I've got one story in the book about a doctor, or a former doctor actually, who worked at the NHS in the UK. And she was like, okay, I love my work. I'm helping people, but I also have my moments of doubt where I think, okay, I'm mostly treating people, who are already quite old, well-insured, relatively wealthy patients. And maybe I can extend their lives by a few months, or if I'm really lucky, a few years. But, today, again, 15,000 kids died from easily preventable diseases, like the easiest to prevent disease. Like, can't I work on that? And so she quit her job and she joined an incubator program at an amazing school in London that I describe as the Hogwarts for do-gooders. It's called Ambitious Impact. Okay. It's a little bit like Y Combinator. Many people will be familiar with that. The incubator in Silicon Valley. It's the Y Combinator, but for nonprofits. So they have a research department that thinks really hard about, what are the most important pressing issues, basically the Gandalfs. And then they look for really driven, ambitious people who want to start a high impact nonprofit. Yeah. And so the research department had come up with this idea that lead poisoning, that is really the thing. It's one of the most neglected global health issues, like millions of people dying from it, mostly kids. And we've got some very straightforward solutions here, lots of low-hanging fruit. And so this doctor, her name is Lucia Coulter, she quit her job, joined that program, launched the NGO, the LEAP, it's called the Lead Exposure Elimination Project. Yep. They're now active in more than a dozen countries. They've convinced the government of Malawi to much more strictly regulate lead in paint. And if you make the calculation here, just in terms of saving lives, she's done the work of thousands of doctors now. Yeah. If you truly believe that everyone's equal out there, that someone's life in, say, Malawi is just as much worth as a life in the UK, then it's pretty awesome, isn't it? And it's so important to keep in mind that this didn't start with her, gazing at her navel, thinking about, oh, how do I get out? What is my passion? It's more like she was like, okay, what can I do? And she found herself some Gandalfs, and they said, well, this is what you can do. Do this. So the great philosopher Bertrand Russell once said that is the mark of a civilized being. So the full quote was, you got to be able to look at a column of numbers, a row of numbers, and be able to weep, to just fully comprehend what's behind that. And we find that difficult. So when we think about the threat of a next pandemic, it's abstract, right? Right. But just think back to the previous one, and the immense suffering it caused, and the 20 million times that people lost one individual, right? It's not 20 million people dying, it's 20 million tragedies. Right. This is really an essential part of what it means to be morally ambitious, is you gotta learn how to count. So if you help one person, that's great. If you help two people, that's twice as much, and this is mathematics. Mm-hmm. And we live in a world of constant triage. So triage is what doctors do, right? In a medical emergency, you gotta choose. You can't help everyone. Right. And that's the world we live in. And as entrepreneurial idealists, we got to be looking for the things that are most pressing right now, where our efforts will just give us the greatest return on investment. It's pretty simple. Well, I might wonder if embracing moral ambition as an approach to managing your career also allows you to look at that spreadsheet and not to weep. Because when I look at that spreadsheet and truly think what it represents, how can I not weep in every moment unless I experience the kind of purpose in my day-to-day that reassures me, well, I'm doing what I can. Yeah, sure. Right? Yeah. So that to me feels like an incredible tool. Yeah. Well, I've got a bit of a mixed message maybe here. So one story in the book is about a British abolitionist who's become a little bit of my hero, my personal role model, my job coach, even though he's now dead for more than 2 centuries.
Fair enough.
His name is Thomas Clarkson, and he devoted his whole life, more than 60 years of it, to fighting the slave trade and then slavery. And, initially when he started working on it, he really went all the way. So he spent the first 7 years just traveling across the United Kingdom, traveling 35,000 miles, spreading the abolitionist propaganda everywhere. And after that, he had an utter and total and complete burnout, a nervous breakdown. He couldn't walk the stairs anymore. He couldn't start talking without sweating profusely. He was just a wreck. He looked as if he was like 60 years old. I'm like, well, Thomas, maybe you should have remembered your breathing exercises, because surely, it's not great if the greatest idealists are burning out. On the other hand, we now live in a world where many people get a burnout while they do work they don't give a shit about.
Yes, it's true.
Right? So
it's true.
If you're going to get a burnout anyway, you might as well do something useful. But yeah, it's hard to deny that if you read the memoirs of the Thomas Clarksons, the Susan B. Anthonys, the Martin Luther Kings, I mean, they didn't live the happiest of lives.
Right.
They lived the most meaningful lives, absolutely. But happy is not the right word to describe it.
Happiness also feels like one of those terms that isn't useful in the moment. It's not an informative idea for whether you should value how you're spending your time. When we optimize for happiness in every moment, our problems are too small.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
My previous life, just being a writer was much easier. Like a book is a very well-defined project.
Sure.
You're basically the dictator in your own book. If you want to change a sentence, well, go and do it. Like backspace and then copy paste or something like that. You don't need permission from the board or from your co-founders or from, anyone else in the organization. So actually building something is quite difficult. Yeah. And I've had many disappointments ever since we started doing this. But I also feel so much alive. And it feels so good to actually have skin in the game, to be building something, to actually be there in the arena. So anyway, that's what I since wish for some of my journalist friends to have.
That to me, to bring us full circle, that to me is the promise of living a life of moral ambition. It's the promise that you will feel the life you're living and that you will feel its connection to the lives that will come after it.
Yeah.
And that's pretty great.
Yeah.
That was historian and author Rutger Bregman. You can find his books wherever books are sold, and you should totally check them out. There's so much I am left thinking about from today's conversation, but in particular, do good and do it well. This idea of moral ambition, it requires blending the idealism of an activist and the chutzpah of an entrepreneur to get things done. And here, the question is not, what are my passions, but what is the world uniquely asking of me? Rutger also wants us to rethink our ideas of success. And I'm the first to tell you, the stuff is hard, right? It's hard to step away from what we are fed about flashy existences, money in the bank, and the kind of job titles that make your parents particularly proud to brag about you on social media. But there is another kind of success to chase. It's a success that may take a lifetime of work, that requires long-term vision. And when you back away from it, you will look at the impact you have made with certainty that your time was well spent. Finally, and this one is so critical, this isn't stuff you should do alone. In fact, you can't do it alone. Part of figuring out how to have and embrace moral ambition is figuring out where to collaborate, who with, what organizations are going to support your emerging worldview, and where you are going to get the direction to put your skills to work. So go looking. You'll find it. Now, we're going to talk about all of this and so much more at Office Hours this week. If you haven't joined us yet, here's your invitation. I will go live along with our senior producer, Sarah Storm, on Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can always find us by going to the news page on LinkedIn. That's LinkedIn News. Do a quick search. Or you can look in the show notes for a link. We'd love to see you there in the comments. Now, if this episode inspired you, Send it to someone you know who needs it today, right away. I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. I'll see you right back here in the studio next week.